The United States produces and exports more ethanol than any other country in the world. In 2016, the U.S. made 15.3 billion gallons of ethanol and shipped more than 1 billion gallons to foreign destinations. Under the Renewable Fuel Standard, the Environmental Protection Agency last week set a target of 15 billion gallons of corn-based ethanol for 2018, part of a nearly 19.3 billion gallon requirement for renewable fuel. The agency also recently rejected petitions asking for a change in the point of obligation, essentially who bears the responsibility of meeting targets. Todd Neeley covers renewable fuels for DTN. He joined us Monday to discuss how the point of obligation impacts ethanol and biodiesel, but we started by asking how the 2018 requirements compare to what those in the industry expected.
I don't think it was a big surprise. I know a lot of people held out hope that perhaps EPA would come out with a set of volumes that are maybe a bit more aggressive, when we talk about cellulosic ethanol and some of these advanced biofuels. But by and large, I think it was pretty much expected, and I think a lot of people will say they were happy with it. It's kind of at this point, it's provided some certainty. The RFS has had a lot of uncertainty in the past 8 years, but this definitely, the timing of it came out on time. It pretty much stuck with what EPA has been saying. And I guess we'll go from there and see what happens.
Cellulosic was reduced from last year's number. Do you think this is a sign that that sector might be struggling?
Yeah, I think to some degree. We've heard about some breakthroughs. Poet up in South Dakota announced that they're getting closer to really making the plant in Emmitsburg, Iowa go like it's supposed to. But definitely there's been a bit of a difficulty getting the industry itself launched commercially. I think we're going to continue to see more of those things come online, more of those plants come online. Also, you're going to hear a lot more about cellulosic ethanol produced at corn ethanol plants across the country. A lot of plants, because of the enzymes they use, they produce a level of cellulosic ethanol. And I think some of that's going to kind of build into the volumes as we go. But clearly, cellulosic ethanol hasn't really met the expectations it had from the beginning.
The 15 billion gallons of corn-based ethanol, do you think that the industry feels it can safely reach above that?
Yeah, I think so. There's been some talk in recent years that perhaps if EPA decided to make some sort of adjustment to the RFS, that perhaps corn ethanol could in some way meet a lot of the demands of the RFS when it comes to cellulosic ethanol, greenhouse gas emissions and all that. And so whether EPA gets to that point is pretty much up in the air, but I think I think that going forward, not only the export markets for corn ethanol are important, but perhaps in a relook at the RFS itself.
Biodiesel certainly believes it can reach above its target, correct?
Absolutely. Our EPA set the number at 2.1 billion gallons for 2018, but all along the industry has said it can produce 2.5 billion, if not more. Not really sure about what's holding up EPA in that regard. I think there's probably still some concerns about imports and those sorts of things, how they might crowd out some of the domestic producers on the RFS and biodiesel. But clearly it's still a tough time for biodiesel because we're still talking about the potential renewal of a tax credit that expired a year ago. And when you keep talking about an RFS that kind of undersells biodiesel, it's still tough on them.
One of the important things the EPA also announced recently was that it would not change the point of obligation. Why is that important?
Well, clearly, one of the things that we hear about is that there are a lot of the people that the EPA wanted or was considering being the people who have to comply with the RFS are probably a lot of companies that couldn't afford necessarily the cost to comply. The thought was if you spread out the cost to thousands more obligated parties, that perhaps it would bring down the overall cost. But in a way, I think the ethanol industry thought that if they go that route, then you're going to see a lot of these people second guess whether they get involved in biofuels. And so I think I doubt that issue is going to come up a lot more because we've seen petitions, dating back a decade, asking EPA to change course, and it didn't even under the Obama administration.
Can you give me an overview of what you think the continued struggle will be over the RFS here in the future?
Yeah, I think we're moving towards some sort of a reform. Now, I don't know what that might entail. Quite honestly, right now, the corn and ethanol industries have a big pull in D.C. They've got, clearly President Trump was supported by corn country quite extensively. So I think the political pressure on the president is such that it'd be interesting to see if he would ever sign a bill that would reform the RFS. However, if there's some needed reforms that would actually benefit the industry, you know, talking about allowing more E15 on a year-round basis, you know, there's that kind of potential. Then when you talk about reform, that perhaps, you know, maybe the ethanol industry at some point would want to do a little give and take.